Hi everyone, and welcome back. Believe it or not, we're in week 6. This is the last week we have before the exam, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But quickly, the topic for today's lecture is published research. And I'm going to say this is my absolute favorite lecture of the year. If you take nothing else from this class, just take this one lecture with you. So without further ado, though, I'm going to talk about the exam next week. So next week is going to be the week of October 12th to October 18th. Here's how the exam week is going to work. The first 2 days of the week, so Monday and Tuesday, that's the 12th and 13th, I will not post the exam, but I'll answer any questions you have. So as you study, if there's anything you want clarification on, shoot me an email, set up a meeting, whatever you want to do, and I will answer your questions. On Wednesday, I'm going to assign the exam. At this point, I will stop answering questions aside from questions about, clarifications on what the exam is asking. Then, on Sunday, the exam will be due. So the format of the exam is that it's worth 100 points total. There are going to be 25 multiple choice questions worth a total of 75 points altogether, and then 5 short answer questions that are worth 25 points altogether. And so here's how this is going to work. The exam is completely open book, open note, open internet. You can Google anything you want. You can look through the PowerPoints. You can read the books. You're at home. You have everything at your disposal. You can also open the exam as many times as you want, from the time that it's assigned on Wednesday to the time that it'll be due on Sunday. So you can go in, you can go out, you can take as long as you want to do this in that time frame. And along those lines, there's no time limit. So once you open the exam, the only deadline that you have is that Sunday due date. So that's it. The exam will be assigned on Wednesday on Blackboard, due on Sunday, and the only days next week that I'll answer any questions are Monday and Tuesday. Again, unless you want clarification on something that the exam is asking you to do. So if you have any questions about that, of course, feel free to shoot me an email and I'm happy to explain. But otherwise, that's what we got. So with that, I'm going to get into the material for today's lecture. And as I said, the topic for today's lecture is published research. And this lecture is going to be broken into 3 parts. The first part is about reading and understanding published research. The second part is going to be about how research goes from doing the actual research stage to being a published study that you might see somewhere. And then the final part is going to be about understanding what are called significant findings in published research. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how to read. So most of you probably know how to read. You're all master's students. But when reading journal articles, there are some strategies that you can use to be as efficient as possible in reading the article. And in order to know which strategy to use, we're going to start with a breakdown of what's in a typical journal article. So every article has a title. That's relatively straightforward. Every article also has an abstract. And the abstract is that paragraph that you see at the very beginning of the article, usually between about 100 and 200 words, and it'll just summarize what the article is doing and how it did it and what it found. Then you're into the body of the article itself. So most articles will start with an introduction in which they're setting up the study. They often tell you what theories they're using, what data they're using, and give some sort of justification for why we should care. Following the introduction, there's often a literature review. Sometimes these 2 things are stuck together, but usually there will be a separate section or multiple sections that review relevant studies that have been done before. Often in this section, the authors of the article are putting forth some sort of argument and explaining why there's a gap in the research that needs to be filled by their wonderful article. So from there, the study will typically move into the data and methods of the study. So in the literature review, they've identified some area in the research that there are still questions, and their study is going to answer those questions. The data and methods tell you about how they're going to do that. So what data are they using? What analyses are they using? Any sort of things that fall into the how the research is getting done portion of the article. Next, they'll write up the results. This is going to be a fairly detailed section that goes into the results of every analysis, that's done in the article. Following the results section, there's often a discussion, and the discussion will usually do a couple of things. First, the discussion typically recaps everything that you just read in the results section in a more summarized way, and the most important findings in the article are usually highlighted in this section as well. The discussion will also talk about any unexpected findings, it'll make connections to other research in the field, and will also often talk about implications that the article might have for either policy or practice or future theoretical development. Following the discussion, there is a reference list that just shows what's cited in the article. And then you'll also find the tables and figures that are referenced throughout the article. Sometimes these are just interspersed throughout the body of the text, which is usually the case if you have an article that's published in a journal. But if you're looking at a draft, they're usually at the end. So, as I said before, this little segment that I have is about how to read a journal article, and specifically how to read a journal article in different sorts of situations. So I'm going to start with suggestions on how to read an article in great depth. But before I do that, let's talk about when you actually want to read an article in great depth, because a lot of the time that's not going to be necessary. Oh, sorry. I'm going to start by talking about when to read an article in great depth, when to read an article quickly, and how to read an article for a class. So there are these different types of strategies that will apply to each of these situations. Sorry, I forgot what I put on my own slide. Okay, so I'm going to start out with suggestions for how to read an article in great depth. But before I do that, which is what I thought I was doing on the last slide, I'm going to talk about when you should read an article in great depth. Sometimes, if you're doing research in the field, there are going to be some really key important studies that have already been done in the area in which you're doing research. These are the studies that have shaped the field, they're foundational, they're fundamental, and you gotta know what's in them. If you have a study like that, you're gonna wanna read it in great depth to really see what they did and how they did it and what they found. If you're critiquing an article, you're also gonna wanna read it in great depth. So there are situations in which you might be called on to really critique an article, and if you do that, you need to have more than a surface understanding of what they did and what they found and so on. So you'd want to read an article in depth if you're doing a critique of it. Another reason to read an article in depth is if you're doing research that's similar. So if somebody's done a study that's really similar to what you're doing, except that maybe you're using different variables, maybe you're using a different theoretical framework or something like that, then it's helpful to read through the article in great depth to get a sense for what it is they did so that you can plan your own research accordingly. So if you're going to read an article in great depth, here's what I recommend. Read through the introduction thoroughly, read through the literature review thoroughly, read through the data and methods thoroughly, read through the results thoroughly, and read through the discussion thoroughly, and then also make sure you pay attention to the tables and figures. So here, if you need to read an article in depth, basically you're paying attention to everything that has a lot of substance. Typically, you can look through the abstract, but it's not going to tell you anything new compared to what's in the other components of the article. So this is probably the least helpful slide here because I'm telling you to do what most of you guys are probably already doing, which is just reading everything in depth. So the takeaway on this one is think about when you actually need to read an article in depth. And I would argue that there are not a whole lot of situations outside of those three that I just outlined where it's strictly necessary to do this. So my next set of suggestions here is on how to read a journal article quickly. Now there are a couple of situations in which you might want to read a journal article quickly. One is if you just want to get the main ideas from it. You're interested in a topic, you want to know what this study did and what it found. You don't necessarily need to go into the nitty-gritty of every single thing they did, you just want to know, what's the main takeaway from this. Another reason to read an article quickly is to cite it in a paper. So oftentimes if you're writing a paper, you need citations for claims that you're making that are not directly central to your specific area of research. When this is the case, it's helpful to read studies quickly to find studies that support the claims that you're making, even if they're a little bit tangential to what you're doing. So if you want to read a journal article quickly, this is how I recommend you do it. Read the abstract. As I mentioned before, the abstract summarizes everything that's in the article, so it'll give you a sense for what they're doing and what to look for. Then it's helpful to skim the introduction. And by skim, I just mean read quickly, don't pour over every word, just try to get the main ideas from what they're saying there. So skim the introduction, see what angle they're coming from, see what kind of theory they're using, what data they're using. Oftentimes, if you're doing this, you can skip the literature review. The literature review will really go into depth about the theory and what they're doing, but if you're just trying to get the main ideas from it, you can usually find those in the introduction itself. It's also helpful to skim the data and methods. So figure out what kind of data it is that they're using and what they're doing with it. Skip the results section because, as I mentioned, the results will often be recapped again in the discussion with the most important findings from the study highlighted. And also, wherever they appear in the research, take a look at the tables and figures because these are often summaries of the results as well. A caveat to this that will also apply to the next slides is that if you don't understand what a study is doing in terms of its methods, skip it. The authors, if they're doing their job, will explain what they found, and trying to figure out some statistical method that you're not familiar with is going to be a waste of your time. So if you're just trying to get main ideas, don't go into the weeds with that and just focus on these sections that are highlighted that point out the main ideas in the study. I'm also going to talk about how to read an article really, really quickly. And there are a couple of situations where you might want to do this as well. One is that you just need to know the main points in the article as soon as possible. And for whatever reasons that you might have a time limit, you just want to know what's in this article. And you don't want to waste any time. Another reason to do this is if you're looking at an article to see if it's worth looking into more. So maybe you're putting together a literature review on something, and you need to know, is it worth my time to read through what's in this article for what I'm doing? Or class is starting in 5 minutes. So this is kind of the first point again, but if you're really, really in a time crunch and you need to know what's in an article, this is where you should look. Read the abstract. As I said before, it's a summary of everything that's in the article. Skim the discussion. This is also going to summarize and highlight the main findings in the article. And then you can usually skip over stuff that's more focused on implications and whatnot that you might not need to know for whatever your purpose is here. And then also take a look at the tables and figures, because as I mentioned before, tables and figures often kind of summarize key findings or key things that are happening in the paper. So that's that. If you need to read an article really, 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 really quickly, go for the abstract and go for the discussion, especially the beginning where the findings are highlighted. And finally, I want to talk about how to read an article for a class. And specifically here I'm talking about substantive classes where you're learning about some sort of topic and you've been assigned articles that focus on that topic. As a disclaimer, if you take my advice here and it doesn't quite fit the class that you're in, please don't blame me for it. But this is what I've found to be because, different classes are going to have different requirements and so on. But I will say that this is what I found helpful when I was in grad school, and this is something that if you're just trying to get through articles for a class where you're learning about some sort of topic, this is a good way to do it. Also, to be clear, when I say when you're learning about some sort of topic, that's in contrast to classes where you're learning about methods. So if you're learning about research methods, you would want to focus more on the methods portions of the article. But if you're just learning about a topic, then this is usually what you need to do. So read the abstract. That's going to give you the summary of the article. Read the introduction and literature review. Here I highlight this because if you're in a class to learn about a topic, the introduction and literature review are where that topic is going to be discussed in detail and other research on that topic are going to be covered. So that's going to give you the background that you'd need to understand what's going on in the study. Skim through the data and methods. So most of you guys are not statisticians. Most of you guys have not taken a lot of classes on research methods because you're in one right now, or statistics or anything like that. So a lot of what's in the data and methods sections are going to be hard to understand and not that helpful to you in taking much out of the article. So I say go in there, take a look at what you see. It's good to know where the data is coming from. It's good to know in general what their plan is to analyze it. Are they doing something with statistics? Is it a qualitative study? But beyond that, don't get bogged down in the details. You can skim the results, or a lot of the times you can skip over them for the most part. So as I said before, the results section is going to go through every analysis and every bit of findings. And I'd say this mostly applies to quantitative studies, so if they're crunching any numbers, most of the time, you don't need to go into great depth about what specific things they found for each one, because they will be summarized again in the discussion. And I probably could have highlighted this and said skim the results section, but the truth is that when you're reading for a class, a lot of the time it's going to be more statistical and more detailed than you actually need. So see again what's summarized in the discussion, and also take a look at the tables and figures, because most of the findings from the results section will also be showing up in those tables and figures as well. So again, disclaimer here, this is what I found helpful when I was a grad student. If you try this in a class and then somebody says, why didn't you read the results in great depth? Don't blame me. But hopefully this is helpful. All right, so that was my quick tour through how to read a journal article. Now I want to talk a little bit about reading the literature review portion and the introduction portion of journal articles where the study is being framed and the literature is being discussed. And as I'll talk about in a couple of slides here, there are things to look out for that can tell you when the contents of your literature review might be more or less trustworthy. But for now, I want you to take a look at this block of text that I have here. That's an excerpt from an article talking about prostitution. And just think for a moment about the tone that's being struck here and think about what it is that you think the author thinks about prostitution. So here they're saying that in calling for the legalization or decriminalization of prostitution, some people believe that they dignify the women in prostitution. However, validating prostitution as work dignifies the sex industry and male consumers, not the women in it. People often do not realize that the decriminalization means decriminalization of most of the major participants in the sex industry, not just the women, which we just said. In addition, they have not thought through the consequences of legalizing pimps as legitimate prostitution entrepreneurs, or the fact that men who buy women for prostitution activities are now accepted as normal consumers of a sexual service. And that's from this article here. So as you read that, and as I also read it, you may have noticed that this author is not a fan of prostitution. So this author is skeptical of the idea of legalizing it, of dignifying it, of giving any legitimacy whatsoever to people who work in prostitution, and uses phrases like men who buy women, which is not a phrase that people who view it as sex work would typically use. Here's another excerpt from an article about prostitution, and this is a different article by a different author. And this author says, prostitution is depicted as immoral or intrinsically harmful, and systems of legal prostitution as dens of iniquity and oppression. As is typical of moral crusades, activists, and now government officials have presented questionable statistics and anecdotal horror stories as evidence of a worldwide epidemic of coerced prostitution. The Crusade's sweeping claims are contradicted by academic research on the sex industry, including comprehensive reviews of the scholarly literature. So just take a moment to think about what this author thinks about prostitution. This author is saying that some people think it's very bad, but describes those thoughts as being a moral crusade, and people who say that as activists, who are in contrast to what all the scholars are saying. So this person obviously has a very, very different view on prostitution. And again, both of these are coming from articles that are published in legitimate journals, but they're both coming at prostitution from very, very different ideological points. And that brings me to something to be on the lookout for when you're reading journal articles, which is problematic literature reviews. And one of the main things that you have to be worried about when you're reading a literature review is ideological bias on the part of the author. And in the last examples there, I'm not trying to tell you what you should think about legalizing or not legalizing prostitution. But as you read through those articles, you should be aware that the authors have an agenda. The first author is very anti-prostitution. The second author is very pro-prostitution. And so as you read through the literature reviews, you should be considering the facts that are presented in light of the author's agenda. And something to keep in mind here is that researchers are people, and people often have agendas and they often have beliefs, and what ends up being written out often reflects those beliefs. And this tends to lead to other things that you might want to look out for in literature reviews. One is what's referred to, and this is all from the Kleck article that was assigned, as the inconsistent application of critical standards. So let's say you're very anti-prostitution. As you review studies, you're going to be very, very critical of any study that suggests that prostitution is okay. But when looking for studies that suggest that prostitution is bad, you might be more willing to allow some fudge room in the quality of the study itself. And with that, you could present an argument that there are a lot of studies showing that prostitution is bad, but wow, look how terrible these studies are that show that it's okay. And that would be a problem if you're not really presenting the evidence in a fair light. Another thing to look out for is the phrase mixed findings when it's not actually followed by a good explanation for what those findings are, or selective omissions of studies that disagree. So let's say now that you are in the pro-prostitution camp and you're reviewing the literature. And what you say is that there's mixed findings regarding whether or not prostitution is harmful. It turns out that the mixed findings you're referring to might be 9 studies that say that prostitution is bad and 1 study that says that prostitution is okay. Technically, those findings are mixed. They're not all the same, but in describing them in that way, you'd be giving an unrealistic picture of what the literature says. Or alternatively, you might just describe the studies that agree with you. So you might find some studies that suggest that prostitution is not that harmful and cite those and talk about those while ignoring the studies that suggest otherwise. And these are all tactics or things that people do unintentionally even that show up often in literature reviews. So it's something to be critical of as a reader. Another thing to look out for is speculation or assertions that the evidence on the other side isn't totally perfect. So what I mean by speculation here would be, let's see, we'll jump back to the anti-prostitution side. You're anti-prostitution and you're describing studies that say that prostitution is all right. You're going to describe the study though, but then you're going to say, but, we don't really know about this and that about that study that disagrees with me. The truth is that there's always things you could speculate about on both sides, but if you see a lot of speculation in one direction, that's often evidence that something is a little bit fishy there. Along similar lines, pointing out that the other side's evidence isn't totally perfect. There is no such thing as totally perfect evidence. All evidence comes from studies, and every single study has limitations. So if the argument is being made that you should discount one side's views because the evidence isn't totally perfect, that's often a sign that something fishy is going on here. And then finally, one thing to look out for are false citations. And oftentimes this is something that's done unintentionally. You see a statement made, you see a string of citations following it, and most people aren't going to follow up and make sure that each of those different citations says the claim that's being made. And a lot of the times, either in the editing process or because of doing a poor job of that quick reading I was talking about, people come up with citations that don't really say the claim that's being made. So to hop over one more time, you're on the pro-prostitution side, and you make a statement that says that numerous studies say that prostitution is not that harmful, and then you cite a whole bunch of studies. If somebody were to really dig into it, it might be that only half those studies make that claim, and the other studies say something similar, but they don't actually support the point that you're making. And as a reader, unless you're aware that this is a possibility, you might take that long list of citations as proof that there is a whole lot of evidence for this statement that's being made. So again, these are all things to look out for when you're reading journal articles. And the biggest one, and the one that often points to other issues, is when there's some sort of ideological bias that's evident in the author's writing. All right, so that was my lecture about reading journal articles. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about where journal articles come from, or the publishing process, and some of the things that you should look out for here as a consumer of research. I'm going to start with how to get published. You're a researcher, you're developing a research question. You've got it. All right, first step. Next, you're going to collect data and analyze it. So you're going to conduct that study that came from your research question. or depending on the kind of study, you might be analyzing data that's already out there. That's fine too. The next step after you've done the study is to write up your results. So you write out that introduction, literature review, data, methods, results discussion into a beautiful, beautiful research paper. Now what do? How does that research paper that you wrote up turn into published research that you might see in a journal or get assigned in a class? The first thing you need to do when publishing a study is to choose a journal to send your paper to. And there are two things that you really need to think about when thinking about what journal something goes to. One is journal fit. In other words, what topics does the journal usually publish? And in the PDF version of not PDF, in the PowerPoint version of this lecture, you can click these links, and this just goes a link to a list of criminology and criminal justice journals. And what you can see there is that there's dozens and dozens and dozens of them. So one thing to think about in the publishing process is always just, where do you want this to go? And so there are some journals that are broad and will publish a lot of things. The biggest journal in our field is criminology, and it publishes a ton of stuff about a ton of topics as long as they're focused on criminology. But there are also more specific journals as well. So there are journals with names like policing that only focus on policing research. The other thing to think about, and the other thing that every researcher who has ever done a research study and then sent it off to a journal thinks about, is the quality of the journal. And this might seem sort of academic, but quality is really, really important, both if you're thinking about where to publish research, but also as a consumer of it. And we'll talk about why in a second. But the quality of a journal is usually measured based on a couple of different things. One is just the prestige in the field. If you ask professors in this department, what are the best criminology journals, there's a good chance that the list that anyone gives you is going to have the same, like 5 or 6 journals on it of the good ones, the best ones. So within fields, some journals are just known to be the best ones. And criminology, as I mentioned before, is the flagship journal of our field, and just about anybody you ask is going to say that is the most prestigious one. Another measure of journal quality is something called impact factor, and there are some other metrics like this that are out there, but impact factor is the most common one. And the impact factor tells you how often articles in this journal get cited. So in other words, how often is the research from this journal being used to further research in other areas? And the higher the impact factor, the better the journal. And that link there on quality just goes to a list of journals that have different impact factors listed. In our field, impact factors tend to max out around 3 or 4. Some journals have impact factors of around 1, some are under 1, and then some don't even have impact factors at all. And those are the ones that are usually a bit more sketchy. So you've picked your journal, you have your beautiful paper that you wrote. The next thing that you're going to do is going to be to submit your research for peer review. Oh, so what peer review means is that the editor of the journal will take your name off your manuscript and send it out to between 2 and 4 other researchers in the field. Those people will read your paper, write out anywhere between a couple paragraphs to a couple pages about what they think of your study, what they think the strengths and the weaknesses are, what should be improved, and so on. And they'll also give a recommendation. So they'll recommend to the journal editor whether they think that study should be published. And this process, as this next bullet point suggests, often takes a long time. So it could be 1 month, but sometimes it's 6 months, and sometimes it takes even more than that before you get your paper back. Something that I want to highlight here that I don't think is that well known is that peer reviewers are not the top experts in the field. Peer reviewers are anybody who has conducted research on a topic. So your peer reviewer might be an esteemed faculty member. It might be a junior faculty member like me. It might be a grad student. So I reviewed a number of papers as a grad student, and other grad students do as well. So anybody who has published research in the field is eligible to be a peer reviewer. And they're just chosen by the editor of the journal or somebody else who works for the journal. And they're chosen based on whether they think the person would be knowledgeable about the topic. But what that means is that, When your journal article goes out for peer review, you could get anybody, anybody in the field anyway, as a reviewer. So the quality of the reviews, sometimes reflects that as well. But anyway, you've submitted your research for peer review, you've waited 1 to 6 months, and then you get the reviews back and you get the editor's decision. So one thing that happens is that the journal article gets rejected. And the reviewers say, this isn't a good enough quality for this journal, or this isn't a good fit for this journal, or whatever the reason is. One thing, and this is what most of us hope for most of the time when we send out research, is a revise and resubmit. This means that you take the reviews into consideration, revise the paper based on those reviews, and resubmit it to the journal. At which point it will go back out to review again to those same reviewers who will see whether you address their concerns well enough. Every once in a while, if you're lucky, you might get a conditional acceptance where the paper is accepted as is with, some minor changes maybe, which is what makes it conditional. And then the holy grail of research is when a paper is just accepted straight out with no changes. That's the kind of thing that maybe happens once or twice in somebody's career. And the reason that I'm going through all of this is that as a consumer of research, so as somebody who is reading research articles, it's helpful to know how articles actually get vetted in terms of their quality and accuracy and goodness overall. And the peer review process is good for many reasons. It's good that it's anonymous. It's good that you're getting people in the field to evaluate research before it's published. It's not a bad thing overall. But there are issues with the peer review process that means that the quality of articles that are published can often be variable as well. So one reason for this is that nobody is an expert in anything. So as an example, I recently reviewed a paper where they were looking at punitive attitudes based on angry responses to pictures of criminals. And I do work in punitiveness. I do work on public attitudes, some on moral emotions, that kind of thing. But how they measured anger in this case was by hooking people up to a machine and seeing how much the muscles in their face changed as they looked at pictures of criminals. I know absolutely nothing about that, right? So as a reviewer on that paper, I had no way of knowing whether the methods that they were using in order to measure anger based on face muscles were good methods. So in my review, I can review the things that I understand, but nobody is an expert in absolutely everything. So it's very possible that when a paper goes out for review, there'll be some key part of it that none of the reviewers are actually all that familiar with, and so things that are a little bit iffy can slip in that way. Another thing is that no one is totally objective, and no matter how hard a reviewer tries to be objective, everybody's coming from their own research background with ideas about how the world works and what the best theories are, and oftentimes that ends up in the reviews as well. So sometimes reviewers will be especially critical of papers that disagree with their views and be more lenient with papers that support their views. So depending on which reviewers you get, it can be harder or easier to get the same paper published, and it's not based on the quality of the paper itself. Another issue, and maybe one of the biggest ones, is that there's actually no incentive to do a good job. So if you're a reviewer on a paper, here's what happens. You get an email from a journal saying, please review this paper. Do you accept or decline? If you want to be a good citizen in the field, and if you want to publish in that journal later, you're going to say, accept. Then you do this work. It's completely anonymous. You don't get paid at all. You do not get recognized at all, except by this one editor of the reviewer who knows that you did a review for them after you asked it, and then you send in the review. So there's really no incentive to do a good job when the only thing that you get recognized for is sending back that review. And so people who care about research and care about the field will generally try to do a good job in reviewing a paper because they are the gatekeepers for whether this article is going to get published and become something that can be referred to more widely by the public. But that said, many people also end up waiting till the very last minute or have other constraints on their time that mean that they're just not putting a whole lot of effort into the review. So really important things can get missed because of this, because reviewers themselves don't have an incentive to double check everything to make sure that everything's okay. And so there's research out there suggesting that there are a lot of math mistakes in published articles, and like a really, really high number of them. And they just don't get caught by reviewers because frankly, reviewers don't have any incentive to get that much into the details of what the article is doing. Not true of all of them, but definitely a common thing that happens. And then finally, there's a big issue with the peer review process, which is that it's not equipped to identify fraud or falsification in research. When reviewers get an article, there is an assumption of good faith that the research itself was actually conducted and not just made up. And there was a scandal last year, as big as a scandal as ever happens in academia, in which 5 articles mentioned in that link there, and then a 6th one a little bit later, were retracted from journals. So they were pulled from journals because there were allegations that they had been completely made up, and the people making those allegations had some pretty good evidence that that was probably the case. And I recommend taking a look at it. It's an interesting read. I'm not going to talk about it too much here because one of the people involved in that was my former PhD advisor, so I'm not really an objective person on this. But it's interesting, and it goes to show that there are articles out there that can just be straight up fake, and there's nothing in the peer review process that really allows that to be caught, because it's all anonymous. You don't know where the data is coming from a lot of the time. You just have to take it on the word of the authors that everything in the article is true. And then finally, there's, I guess, a more general issue with the peer review process, which is that every reviewer is coming into this with their own ideas about what the paper needs. Oftentimes, it's based on whatever research they're doing. Oftentimes, it's based on whatever methods were popular when they were in grad school. Whatever the case is, papers end up with a lot of suggestions from reviewers. Many of them will make the paper stronger, but many of them will just add to the paper in ways that are not that helpful. So that's what this cartoon is saying. You submit your nice manuscript as a car, and you end up with a laser cannon, because. So all of that was talking about peer review, but there's one more type of article that I think it's really important to be aware of, one of which you were assigned for this week. So of the articles that you read today, I want you to think about which one might have been accepted at a predatory journal, meaning a journal that publishes articles without reviews or revisions for a processing fee. If this was your answer, you're right. So the article titled "Get Me Off Your Fucking Mailing List" is an actual article that was accepted in a journal. The journal it was accepted in, though, is a complete scam, and there are a lot of journals out there like this. They sound and look really official, but what they do is publish any article that gets sent their way as long as you pay them a fee. So anything that comes into their inbox is getting published as long as the author pays a fee. In this case, this article that you read here would have been published as long as the authors paid the fee of $150. And the authors decided not to pay that fee, but they did make a good point here, I think, which is that you can get anything published if you're willing to pay. And this is a big issue because when people consume research, oftentimes they're not thinking about these journals. And there's an assumption that if something is published in an academic journal, it means that it's legitimate. However, scam journals like the one that published "Get Me Off Your Fucking Mailing List" often look really legitimate just at a glance. So this is the website for the journal that accepted that article. And this just looks like any other journal. This is a screenshot from last year, but if you look at it from now, it's updated to 2020. They have all these nice links on the side here that tell you important things about how the manuscript should be published. They have a fancy name. They even made up their own sort of impact factor thing, their MIARICDS factor, which means absolutely nothing, but it looks really official. And so this is an issue because if you ever see something cited and it's in a journal like this, it could be complete bunk. And you as the consumer of research need to be able to determine which journals are real and which journals are total BS. Because nobody's going to tell you that, right? So that's just something to keep in mind. There are issues with the peer review process, but then there are journals that completely subvert the peer review process altogether and just publish articles for a fee. As I mentioned, these are called predatory journals, and they're absolutely, completely untrustworthy because they'll publish anything. So in thinking about an article that you're reading, it's good to see what the journal is. If it's a prestigious journal, if it's a decent journal in the field, that's usually a sign that it went through rigorous peer review. And while there are some issues to be aware of there, it's still a pretty good process. But if it's one of these journals, just run as fast as you can away from it. Okay, so now we're getting to the last topic for this lecture, which is the idea of significant findings. And significant findings are what gets published in the news. They're the headline of the article. They are the thing that the article found. But significant findings actually has a more technical meaning that doesn't always reflect what is implied by the way they get talked about. And because of this, I want to show some of my favorite correlations here, which you may have seen these in other classes before because they're just hilarious. But this is a graph showing the correlation between the number of films that Nic Cage appeared in and the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool. It's a very high and significant correlation. Similarly, this is a graph showing the number of films that Nic Cage appeared in and the number of people who died by being hit by sports equipment. And this is also a significant correlation. So the clear conclusion from these graphs is that when Nic Cage is in a lot of films, you should be really careful by a pool or when playing sports because you're more likely to die. Wait, no, that's not the conclusion at all. So in these, what you're seeing are spurious correlations. These are correlations that just happen totally by chance. And if you look through enough variables, you can find things that just so happen to line up, like these did. But they don't actually mean anything. And this leads me into talking about significant findings. Whether or not a finding is considered significant is often based on a particular statistic called a p-value. And so those correlations that I showed you before are significant in the sense that the correlation itself has a low p-value. So what does that mean? What a p-value tells you is how likely your sample results are based on some assumption about the population. So for example, if we're assuming that there is no relationship between Nic Cage films and drowning, a low p-value would tell you that what we actually see in the data is unlikely, given that expectation that there's no relationship between those things. So a significant finding there means that the correlation that you saw in that last graph is unlikely to have occurred given no relationship between Nic Cage films and drownings. The null hypothesis is a statement made by a researcher about what is thought to be true in the population that you're drawing a sample from. And I'm going to go through another example here that's a little bit less wacky than Nic Cage, just to show what the difference between significant findings and non-significant findings might be. So let's say that we have a hypothesis that undergrads and grad students at Rutgers have the same level of support for marijuana legalization. This is our null hypothesis, our statement about what might be true in the population. If we were to do research and obtain a low p-value, this would be evidence against our null hypothesis. So this would be evidence that they have different views about marijuana legalization. So let's say we take samples of undergrads and grad students at Rutgers and ask them whether they support marijuana legalization. You might end up with a sentence like this. So in our hypothetical samples that we took here, 68% of our undergrad sample supported legalization, while 52% of our grad student sample supported legalization. And this is a totally made up set of statistics, by the way. But what I want you to pay attention to is that I have p equals 0.02 written at the end of this sentence. What this means, if you were to see it written out as the findings for a study, is that the difference in percentages that we see here in these samples is unlikely to have happened by chance if it's true that undergrads and grad students have the same level of support in the population. And we can interpret this difference more formally as saying that if undergrad students and grad students had the same level of support for marijuana legalization in the population, we would only see a difference in sample proportions this big or bigger 2% of the time. And so, as I've said before, this isn't a math class. I'm not going to be expecting you to really do much with these p-values, but it's important to know what they are because, as I said before, they tell you whether your findings are quote-unquote significant. I'm just going to go through one more example of a p-value just to show, again, what it is and how it's interpreted. So same definition as on the last slide. Same null hypothesis as on the last slide. We're going to say, our statement about what might be true in the population is that undergrad students and grad students at Rutgers have the same level of support for marijuana legalization. But this time we're going to say we took samples, and in our undergrad sample, 62% of undergrads supported legalization, while 58% of grad students supported legalization. Again, totally made up numbers. But here our p-value is 0.56. And so when you're reading research studies, you'll see a lot of times p-values reported in parentheses like this, and this is what this would mean. This would mean that if undergrad students and grad students had the same level of support for marijuana legalization in the population, we would see a difference in sample means this big or bigger 56% of the time. In other words, assuming they had the same exact level of support for marijuana legalization, it's pretty likely that we'd see a gap of 4 percentage points here, like what we see in this sample, just based on chance. Like you just happen to pick a couple undergrads in your sample who support it, you just happen to pick a couple grad students in your sample who don't support it. So here's why that matters. Research findings count by most standards if p is less than 0.05. So if there is a 5% chance or less that your research findings didn't occur by chance, they're considered statistically significant. Where this causes problems sometimes is, well, in a couple of things. One of them is false positives. If we're saying that there has to be a 5% chance or less that your research findings didn't happen just based on random variation, that's still a 5% false positive rate. So 5% of the time, if we're using a p-value of 0.05 as our threshold, 5% of the time, whatever difference you see in your sample compared to what you were expecting about the population did happen by chance. And it's just totally random variation, and it means absolutely nothing. So 5% of the time, findings based on this threshold mean absolutely nothing. But more concerning than that, because p-values often go pretty far below 0.05, so you might have some slightly better evidence if that's the case. But there's also something called p-hacking that you need to look out for. And p-hacking sounds dramatic, but what it is fudging around with the way the research is conducted, or how many people are in a sample, or what analyses you're using to come up with a p-value that's equal to 0.05 or less. Again, because if it's under 0.05, you get to say that your findings are significant and they count. But the thing is, if you're getting to a p-value of 0.05 by, say, adding a couple people to your sample, it's not really that you have found a finding that counts any more than what you had before you added those people to your sample. It's just that you found a way to get that number under 0.05 so that you can get it published as a significant finding. There's also something called the file drawer problem. And it is an unfortunate truth about journals and publishing that journals want to publish significant findings because they're interesting, they're new, it means that you found something. And studies that don't find a significant relationship between variables often either don't get written up, or if they do get written up, they don't get published, so they go into the file drawer. So if you're looking at a relationship between two variables, chances are the things that get published are going to be the things that find a relationship between those two variables. Whereas the things that don't get published are going to be the things that don't find a relationship between those variables. So imagine, for instance, that you're looking at research about, say, zero tolerance policing, and you want to know, does zero tolerance policing reduce crime? It may be that when people conduct research on zero tolerance policing, the studies get published when they find that, yes, it does in fact reduce crime. And they don't get published when they find that there's no relationship between whether somebody does zero tolerance policing and whether crime goes down. This means that a review of the literature is going to show overwhelming support in favor of zero tolerance policing as an answer to crime. And this is a problem because it's really hard to sort out, what hasn't been published. And there are some methods out there that I'm not going to get into that try to do this statistically. But really, however you get at it, this is a problem when looking at research, because the only things that get published are the things that show these significant findings. And it's not the case all the time, but it's much harder to publish something that doesn't find a significant relationship. All right, so my final point here is also going to be that statistical significance does not mean real-life significance. If you think back to the definitions that I gave on the last slides for what your p-value means, it's a measure of how likely it is that whatever you saw in your sample could have happened by chance based on some assumptions about the population. It doesn't mean that there was a big effect. It doesn't mean that there's an important effect. It just means that it's unlikely your sample occurred by chance. So sometimes you see really, really small or unimportant, however you want to call something important or unimportant, but really small relationships that don't have a lot of real life or practical significance reported as being statistically significant. And one of the things that can impact this is sample size. So if you have a really, really big sample, you're much more likely to find something to be statistically significant than if you have a small sample, no matter how big the effect is. So let's say that zero tolerance does reduce crimes, but it reduces crimes from, let's say, 100 per 100,000 people to 99 per 100,000 people. So we're not actually shifting crime by much there, but let's say that we really are shifting crime by that 1 crime per 100,000 person with this policing strategy. With the right study, you might find that difference to be statistically significant, but that doesn't mean that that's a really important difference practically. And it could be, in that particular example, maybe we're reducing crime, but we're causing other problems that far outweigh that very, very small statistically significant relationship that we found. So one thing to look out for when you see statistically significant findings is how big the effect actually is. So what's actually being described here? What's actually happening here? And not just, is the finding significant or not? So the last thing I'm going to talk about for this is the article that was assigned for today. And this is a fun article, I think, because the authors ran a study in which they found this shocking finding. People who listened to When I'm 64 by the Beatles rather than to Kalimba became younger. That's amazing, right? They found the fountain of youth. They did an experimental study and they found that people became younger after listening to When I'm 64 by the Beatles compared to Kalimba. Except that's not true. Even though, if you look in the last sentence there at the very end, we have a p-value of 0.040. In other words, a statistically significant finding. And instead what this study did was p-hack the crap out of this thing, right? So they ran a study, but then they changed all these different parameters of the study. They included measures, they excluded them, they changed the number of participants, and they did all sorts of things just to get this one statistic, the p-value, under that threshold of 0.05. And what this study illustrates is that these decisions made by researchers, that hundreds and hundreds of decisions like this are made over the course of any particular study, these decisions made by researchers can affect the statistical significance of the findings, and in other words, the findings that are reported as being, true. And so if you read through this, you saw that there are a whole bunch of different things that they did in order to get this p-value under 0.04. The takeaway here is that listening to the Beatles does not make you younger. Instead, it's just really, really easy to manipulate a study to make it look like something is statistically significant if you're setting out to do that. And as a consumer of research, it's important to look for things that might suggest that a finding is not really as important or significant as its p-value suggests. And more generally, just to be aware of what significant findings mean in this context. So with this, I'm going to lead into your activity for this week. I said this is my favorite lecture. I think this is also my favorite of the activities. And I want you to think about this study that shows that eating chocolate helps you lose weight. And it was reported in dozens of outlets, including some big ones like the Huffington Post. I think that column there is from Self magazine. And over and over and over again, they're reporting on this finding that chocolate accelerates weight loss. And this is a finding from research. Look, it says it there in the headline. Research shows this. And for your activity here, which is going to be due Thursday, like other activities, we're going to be looking at that chocolate study and evaluating it. In order to do so, I want you to read a short write-up about the study itself and what happened afterwards and how it got into the news. That'll be posted on Blackboard this week as well. And after you read through that, I want you to tell me, first of all, did the original study find significant results for chocolate as a weight loss aid? And spoiler alert, they did. But then I really want you to think about it and tell me whether you think these results are meaningful. In other words, based on this study, can we really say that chocolate helps people lose weight? Then I want you to look through the article write-up. It's from IO9. I think they mostly do science fiction articles, but they did a write-up on this. So that's what I'm talking about when I say the article. So they also talk about what kind of journal the study was published in and how it got into that journal. So look for the type of journal, and then also look for information about the peer review process. And then finally, tell me whether you think the news outlets that reported on the study did a good job of reporting on it, and why or why not. And in this activity, what I really want you to think about, and again, sort of the main takeaway from this, is that you should always be skeptical of findings that are reported by the news, and findings that are, just reported without context, because there are lots and lots of things that go into whether something gets reported as a statistically significant finding. So it's so important to be a good consumer of research and to use what you learn in this class or in other classes or anywhere you learn it, but use that to be able to look at research and sort of understand where it's coming from and put the results in context. Because there's some really great research out there that absolutely provides insight into the world, and it's important and it's wonderful, but you have to be able to sort that out from the research that's kind of just bunk. So as with most of these activities, each question listed on the previous slide can be answered with a sentence or two, graded based on effort and correctness. And as I've done in the previous weeks, I'll send out a summary email later, kind of talking about what you guys did well, and then also any areas that people seem to have any confusion. So responses to the activity should be posted to the discussion board by this Thursday. That'll be the 8th at 11:59 p.m. And again, comment on 2 other students' responses by Sunday the 11th at 11:59 p.m. And otherwise, have a great week.